The great hall was still warm with sound. The last notes of the final piece had been swallowed up by thunderous applause just minutes before. Now, the air hummed with a different kind of energy, the buzz of excited conversation, the rustle of fine clothes, and the satisfied murmur of a crowd that felt they had witnessed something special. At the center of it all, near the grand piano that glowed like a pool of black oil under the stage lights, stood the man responsible for the evening's magic. He was a famous pianist, a man whose name was printed in elegant scripts on concert programs around the world. His face was flushed with the effort and triumph of the performance, and a brilliant, easy smile was fixed upon it. A small crowd of well-dressed admirers formed a half-circle around him, hanging on his every word. He held a glass of sparkling water, gesturing with it as he spoke. "And so I told the conductor," he said, his voice carrying in the emptying space. "If the tempo is a funeral march, then we must all wear black, yes?" The group erupted in polite, delighted laughter. He basked in it, his eyes sparkling. This was part of the performance, too, this after-show ritual. He felt electric, alive, king of his own little domain. Across the wide stage, away from the circle of light and laughter, a woman moved. She was dressed in a simple, dark uniform, the kind meant to blend into the background. In her hands was a small plastic caddy holding a spray bottle, clean cloths, and a trash bag. She was methodical, quiet. Her eyes were on her work, collecting the empty water bottle left by the cellist, wiping a faint smudge of condensation from the lid of the piano. She was invisible to the celebrating group. To them, she was part of the hall itself, like a chair or a music stand necessary, but unseen. She preferred it that way. The music, still echoing in the bones of the building and in her own chest, was what she cared about. The cleanup was just her task, her way of honoring the space where such sounds lived. As she worked her way closer to the piano, her gaze fell on the magnificent instrument. Even under the bright lights, she could see a fine layer of dust and a few fingerprints on its glossy black surface. Near the keys, it was a shame, she thought. Such a beautiful creature should be cared for. She pulled a fresh, soft cloth from her caddy. The pianist's sharp eyes, always roaming, caught her movement. He saw the woman in the cleaning uniform approaching his instrument, the sacred tool of his art. A playful, slightly possessive idea sprung into his head. Here was a chance to extend the performance, to share a joke with his audience. He raised his voice, cutting across his own story. "Ah, careful, careful," he called out, his tone light and teasing. The woman froze, her cloth an inch from the piano's surface. She looked up, her eyes wide and surprised, like a deer spotted in a forest. The pianist gave her a broad, theatrical smile. He took a few steps toward her, his followers turning like a flock of birds to see the new amusement. "That instrument, my dear woman," he said, nodding at the Steinway, "it is a wild beast, a sleeping dragon." He chuckled. "It has very sharp teeth, you know. It can bite the fingers of those who do not know its secrets." His entourage tittered on cue. They saw the game now. The great maestro was being charmingly mischievous. The woman simply stood, holding her cloth, saying nothing. A faint pink flush crept up her neck. Emboldened, the pianist took another step. He waved a hand gracefully toward the keyboard. "Perhaps you would like to try to tame the dragon?" His eyes twinkled with good-natured condescension. "We could all use a little. What is that famous piece? Chopsticks, yes. Give us a rendition of Chopsticks. We will be your most generous audience." This drew a louder, more genuine laugh from the group. A man in a tuxedo grinned. A woman in a silk dress covered her smile with her hand. It was a gentle joke, they thought, harmless. The great man was including the cleaning lady in the fun. The woman looked from the laughing faces back to the pianist. For a long second, she was utterly still. The initial shock in her eyes settled into something else, something calm and deep. The flush on her neck faded. She did not look at the floor, as one might expect. Instead, she met the pianist's gaze directly. It was a brief look, but it held a stillness that was unnerving amidst the chatter. Then, the corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something smaller, more private. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It is a fine instrument," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the sudden quiet that had fallen. It had a slight, unplaceable accent, smoothing the edges of her words. "A very fine instrument." She paused, and her eyes flicked to the piano's upper cabinet, as if she could see right through the wood. But she continued, her tone as matter of fact as if she were noting a stain on the floor. "It has been slightly out of tune since this afternoon's rehearsal. The F sharp in the sixth octave. It is flat, just a little. The humidity. Perhaps. She finished speaking and went back to her task. She gently, respectfully, laid her cloth on the glossy wood and began to wipe in slow, circular motions, polishing the surface to a deeper shine, for 5 full seconds. There was absolute silence on the stage. The laughter had died so completely it was as if it had never been. The smiling faces of the patrons were frozen in place, their expressions sliding from amusement to confusion. The pianist's own brilliant smile had vanished. He stared at the woman, his head tilted slightly, as if he had not heard her correctly. His mind, so full of melody and clever lines a moment ago, went blank and white, out of tune. The F sharp? How could she? He had, in fact, noticed a very slight sourness in a particular melodic run during the second movement, a tiny grit in the otherwise smooth engine of the piece. He had blamed it on his own fingering, a moment of fatigue. He had not mentioned it to anyone. He looked from the woman's calm, focused face to the magnificent, silent piano, and then back to her. The comfortable world of the stage, where he was the undisputed master, shifted slightly beneath his feet. The cleaning woman with her soft voice and her cloth had just, without any malice at all, pulled back a corner of the scenery to show him something he did not understand. The woman finished polishing the section of the piano. She picked up her caddy, gave a small, polite nod not to the pianist, but to the instrument itself, and turned to walk away, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the wooden stage. The spell broke. The man in the tuxedo coughed. The woman in silk adjusted her bracelet, but their eyes were now fixed on the retreating figure, not on the famous pianist. The maestro stood rooted to the spot, watching her go. All the post-concert joy had drained from him, replaced by a burning, prickling curiosity. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, not about another person, and certainly not about someone who cleaned the halls he played in. Who was she? How could she possibly know that? He held up a hand to his still waiting admirers. "Please," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Excuse me for a moment," and without another word, he began to walk, not toward the glittering lobby where a reception awaited, but toward the shadowy wings of the stage, in the direction the cleaning woman had gone. The silence the cleaning woman left behind was thick and strange. For the pianist, the usual sounds of the emptying hall, the distant clatter from the lobby, the soft thuds of cases being closed seemed to fade away. All he could hear was her soft voice, so certain, pointing out a flaw he had felt but ignored. His admirers shifted uncomfortably. The man in the tuxedo finally spoke, trying to bring back the old mood. "Well, the backstage crew must be full of experts these days, eh?" He gave a weak laugh that no one joined. The pianist didn't even hear him. He was already moving. "Please," he said again, his voice distracted, as he handed his glass of water to the woman in the silk dress. "Enjoy the reception. I'll be along shortly." He walked off the stage, his polished shoes clicking on the hard floor, leaving his little circle behind. They exchanged glances, a mix of confusion and slight offense, before slowly drifting toward the party noises. Buzzing now with this new piece of gossip, the backstage area was a maze of ropes, dark curtains, and stacked equipment. The golden light of the stage gave way to the practical, harsh glow of fluorescent tubes overhead. He saw a stagehand coiling a thick cable. "The cleaner?" the pianist asked, his tone more abrupt than he intended. "The woman who was just here. Where did she go?" The stagehand jerked a thumb towards the rear of the building. "Probably the utility closet by the loading dock, sir. Or maybe heading out. Her shift's likely over." The pianist moved quickly, his long legs carrying him past instrument cases and quiet, shadowy corners. He felt an urgency he couldn't explain. It was like hearing a wrong note and being unable to continue until you found it, fixed it. He wasn't angry, not really. He was unraveled. He pushed through a heavy fire door and into a concrete-walled corridor. The air was cooler here, smelling of floor wax and dust. And there she was, at the far end, placing her cleaning caddy on a metal cart already laden with brooms and trash bags. She was taking off her dark work jacket, hanging it on a hook. "Wait," he called out, his voice echoing in the bare corridor. She turned, and seeing him, her body seemed to stiffen slightly. She looked tired under the fluorescent light, older than she had seemed on the stage. Her hands, now visible without the jacket, were pale and looked strong, with short, practical nails. I did not get your name," he said, stopping a few feet from her. He suddenly felt out of place in his tailored suit, his presence overwhelming in this small, Utilitarian space. It's not important, she said softly, turning back to straighten a bottle on her cart. The performance was beautiful. Thank you. It was a dismissal, polite and final. But what you said, he pressed, taking a small step closer. About the piano. How did you know that? She kept her back to him for a moment, then slowly turned to face him again. Her expression was guarded, a door half closed. I have good ears, she said simply. I listen to the rehearsals. Sometimes I hear things. It's more than good ears, he said. He heard the passion in his own voice, the same intensity he used when discussing a difficult passage with another musician, to identify a single note, in a specific octave, as being flat. That is perfect pitch. That is training, a flicker of something alarm, or maybe pain passed behind her eyes. She looked down at her hands, rubbing a thumb over a knuckle. It was a long time ago, she murmured, almost to herself. It doesn't matter now. I should go. She moved to walk past him, back towards the door to the main hall gently, almost without thinking. He shifted his stance, not blocking her path completely, but making it clear he wished her to stay. It was not a command from a maestro, but the gesture of a student asking a teacher to explain. Please, he said, and this time the word was stripped of all its pride. It was just a request. I must know. Who are you? The corridor was silent. Somewhere, a water heater clicked on with a low rumble. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if weighing the cost of answering. The defensiveness in her posture softened, just a little, replaced by a deep, old weariness. Once, she began, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear. I was a student, in another country, a lifetime away. She spoke not to him, but to the concrete wall beside her. My teacher. He was a great man, not famous like you, but great. He could make a piano sound like it was weeping or laughing. He was a student of one of the old masters, a true master. She swallowed, her throat moving. I was good, very good. It was all I was, all I thought I would be. Her gaze was far away, lost in a memory he could not see. Then, the war came. Not a war on television, but a war in your street, in your kitchen. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the corridor wasn't cold. Everything was gone. The piano, the conservatory, my home, my family. The words fell into the space between them like stones. The pianist felt a cold knot form in his stomach. His world of concert halls and encores felt suddenly fragile and foolish. I came here, she continued, her tone flattening, becoming factual, as if reciting a difficult lesson. No papers, no language, no money. The music. She paused, and for the first time, her voice cracked. The music was a room inside my heart, but the door to that room was locked. I could not open it. There was too much noise behind it, too many echoes. She looked at her hands again, turning them over. So I found other work, quiet work. My hands are still useful, and I found this place, a ghost of that earlier. Private smile touched her lips. Here, I can be near the music. I can listen. I can care for the instruments. It is enough. It is more than enough. The pianist could not speak. He felt a profound shame, hot and sour, for his joke about chopsticks. He had been dancing on the surface of something, while she carried an ocean inside her. A noise made them both turn. The stagehand from before poked his head into the corridor. Maestro, they're asking for you at the reception. The mayor is here. The spell was broken. The cleaning woman's distant look snapped back to the present. She nodded to the stagehand, then turned to the pianist. You should go. They are waiting for you. But he couldn't, not now. Going back to the chatter and the champagne felt impossible. The puzzle had only deepened, and the mystery had become a person, a story that demanded respect, not curiosity. He looked from her tired, proud face to the distant glow of the party. He made a decision. He turned to the stagehand. Please, he said, his voice firm. Tell them I am indisposed. A matter of artistic importance. The stagehand looked confused, but nodded and disappeared. The pianist turned back to the woman. Her eyes were wide with surprise now, and something else of faint, glimmering apprehension. He gestured back down the corridor, toward the stage they had left. Please, he said again, this third please carrying the weight of an apology, an invitation, and a plea all at once. Come back with me, just for a moment. Why? She whispered, her guard fully up again. He looked at her, no longer seeing a cleaner, but seeing the ghost of the prodigy she had been, the survivor she was. Because the instrument is out of tune, he said softly, and I would like to hear what else you hear. She stood frozen in the cold corridor, her arms still wrapped tightly around herself as if holding her story inside. The pianist's words hung in the air between them. I would like to hear what else you hear. The noise of the reception was a distant, muffled hum. Here, by the loading dock, the world was made of concrete and silence. She looked at the man in his elegant suit, his face now stripped of its proud smile, etched with something that looked like genuine urgency, not a command, but a request. It had been so many years since anyone had asked her for anything to do with music. Slowly, she shook her head. There is nothing to hear, she said, her voice low. That part of my life is a closed book. The book just opened a page, he replied gently. He took a small step back, giving her space. I am not asking for a performance. I am asking for a consultation, as one musician to another. The phrase struck her. One musician to another. It was a key, rusty and unused, scraping in a lock she thought had been welded shut. She glanced at her hands, at the work-roughened skin. She thought of her teacher's hands, gentle yet powerful, and the last thing he had said to her before the world fell apart. The gift is not in your fingers, it is in your listening. Never stop listening. She had stopped, but today, she had listened, and she had spoken. A long, slow breath escaped her. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Without a word, she walked past him, not toward the glittering party, but back through the heavy door toward the dark maze of backstage. He followed, a silent shadow. They did not speak as they navigated the ropes and darkened sets. The stage, when they emerged onto it, was a vast and empty cathedral. The audience seats were dark caverns. Only the work lights were on, casting long, dramatic shadows. The grand piano sat in its pool of faint light, a silent, waiting beast. She walked toward it, her steps slow on the wooden boards. She stopped a few feet away, not touching it. Play the F sharp, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the huge space. The pianist moved to the bench, sat, and found the note. He played it. The sound was clear, but to his now attuned ear, it had a slight dullness, a lack of shimmer. It was flat. You are right, he said, his voice full of wonder. It is the pen, she said, not moving from her spot. The change in temperature from afternoon to evening, with the stage lights, it has tightened the wood just a fraction. A half turn of the tuning hammer would fix it. But it is better to wait for the morning, when the hall is cold and still. He stared at her. This was not just perfect pitch. This was the deep, physical knowledge of an instrument, of wood and wire and physics, the knowledge of a craftsman. How he began, but stopped. The question was too big. She finally approached the piano, but she did not sit. She stood beside it, and with a reverence that was palpable, she reached out and with a single finger, pressed the A above middle C. She held the key, the damper pedal depressed, with her foot, letting the single, pure note bloom and fill the empty hall. It vibrated in the air, a perfect, unwavering tone. As it faded into silence, she spoke, her eyes on the keys. My teacher's teacher, he played for Shostakovich. He survived the siege of Leningrad. He said music was not about beauty, but about truth. The truth of a single note, of a moment of silence. Her finger lifted. This note is true. The F sharp is not. That is all I heard. The pianist felt a chill that was not from the cool air. He was in the presence of a lineage, a direct thread back to giants of history, and it was standing beside him in a cleaning uniform. What was his name? He whispered, afraid to break the spell. She shook her head. Names do not matter now. He is gone. My teacher is gone. She finally looked at him, her eyes glistening in the low light. The war took the piano from our house. Soldiers used it for firewood. I watched it burn. It snapped and sang as the strings broke in the heat. That was the last music from that instrument. The image was so brutal, so final, that the pianist flinched. His own childhood piano, lovingly cared for, sat in a Paris apartment. He could not conceive of such a loss after that. She continued, her voice a dry monotone. My hands, they could not find the way. When I finally got to a piano, in a refugee center, I sat. I put my hands on the keys, and all I could see was the fire. All I could hear was the snapping. My fingers were stones. She flexed her hands, looking at them as if they belonged to someone else, so I let it go. To carry that silence with me, was too heavy. It was easier to build a new life with no music in it, just the echo of it, from a distance, like tonight. The confession hung in the air. The pianist understood now. This was not stage fright. This was a profound, spiritual injury. He thought of his own relationship with the piano, a demanding friend, sometimes a tormentor, but always his voice. To have that voice ripped away, not by choice, but by trauma. He slid off the piano bench and stood up, facing her. "You told me the door to that room was locked," he said softly. She nodded, looking down. "Do you still have the key?" Her head jerked up. A tumult of emotions crossed her face: fear, longing, deep sadness. "I threw the key away," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I had to." For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet hall, the magnificent instrument between them. The pianist's mind raced, every instinct as a performer, as an artist who lived to communicate, screamed at him to coax her, to convince her to play. But the man who had just heard her story knew that would be another violence. He did something he had not done in decades. He made an offer with no expectation, no audience, no reward. He gestured to the bench. "The piano is yours, for as long as you wish. The hall is empty. There is no one to hear you but me, and these old walls." He took several steps back, moving into the shadows near the wings, giving her the entire stage. "You do not have to play a piece. You do not have to play at all. You could just sit with it. Or you could close the lid, and we will walk away. It is your choice." He meant it, every word. She looked from him, a shadow now, to the waiting piano. It seemed to gleam in the dim light, both inviting and accusing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, frightened rhythm. The old panic rose in her throat, the smell of smoke, the sound of cracking wood, the screaming silence that had lived inside her for so long. But underneath that terror, something else stirred. It was faint, like the memory of a scent. It was the feel of smooth ivory under her fingertips, the weight of her teacher's hand on her shoulder, the truth of a single, perfect day. Her feet, as if moving on their own, carried her to the bench. She did not sit in the center, as a performer would. She sat slightly to the left, an old habit from when she was a child and would share the bench with her teacher. She placed her hands in her lap, clenched into fists. She closed her eyes. The pianist, watching from the darkness, held his breath. He wondered if she would simply get up and leave. Minutes passed. The only sound was the distant, final clang of a locker from the cleaning crew far away. Then, she uncurled her fists. Slowly, trembling, she raised her right hand. She held it over the keys, not touching them. It shook in the air. And then, she lowered it, not to play a chord or a melody, but to gently, so gently, lay her palm flat on the cool, smooth surface of the white keys. A touch of greeting, a touch of goodbye. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, cutting through the dust of the day. It fell silently onto the back of her hand. She left her hand there for a long time, feeling the solidity, the potential, the life of the instrument humming silently up through the wood. She was not playing music. She was remembering what it felt like to be home. Her hand rested on the keys, a bridge between a past she thought was ash and a present that felt suddenly, terrifyingly alive. The cool ivory was a shock against her skin. She could feel the faint, almost imperceptible vibration of the hall itself. Through the piano, the distant rumble of a truck outside, the hum of the electricity and the lights. Life. She opened her eyes. They were not looking at the pianist in the shadows, or at the dark, empty seats. They were fixed on her own hand, as if it belonged to a stranger. Slowly, she curled her fingers, letting the pads of her fingertips make contact with the keys. Just the slightest pressure, no sound. The memory was not of fire, it was of light. Morning light through the high windows of the old conservatory, falling on the sheet music, making the notes look like they were floating. It was the smell of old paper and floor polish. It was the warm weight of her teacher's approval, a simple nod that meant more than any applause. Her left hand came up, joining the right. They settled into a position, an old, familiar shape her body had never truly forgotten. Her back straightened, not into a performer's posture, but into one of deep, focused attention. The trembling in her hands stopped. From the wings, the pianist watched. He saw the transformation. The tired cleaner was gone. In her place was someone else, someone with a quiet, grounded authority. He felt like an intruder, witnessing something profoundly private. He dared not move, barely dared to breathe. Her right thumb pressed down. Middle C. The note was not struck. It was breathed into existence. It was full and round, and she held it, letting it speak. Then, with her left hand, she played a simple, open fifth below it. It was the most basic building block of music, a sound of stability, of home. She did not rush. She listened to the notes decay, listening to how they lived together in the air of the great hall. Then, her right hand moved, tracing a slow, ascending pattern. It was not a recognizable tune. It was an exploration, a testing, a conversation with the instrument. A few notes here, a hesitant chord there. The sounds were clean, perfectly balanced, even in their simplicity. Her touch was exquisite, not powerful, but infused with a clarity that made each note ring like a small, pure bell. The pianist felt his eyes grow damp. He had heard countless virtuosos play with staggering technique, but this was different. This was not performance, this was recovery. It was the sound of someone finding a lost language, word by precious word. Then, her hands stilled again. They hovered, as if deciding. The echoes of the simple notes faded into a waiting silence. She began to play. It was not the thunderous, technical showpiece he might have expected from a prodigy. It was something else entirely. A gentle, melancholic melody emerged, one that seemed to rise from the piano itself. It was a piece by a composer from her homeland, one whose music was often a prayer wrapped in sorrow, a memory of landscapes and losses. The melody was simple, haunting, repeating and turning back on itself like a question with no answer. Her playing was not flawless. A finger stumbled once, fumbling for a note. She did not stop. She breathed, waited a fraction of a second, and continued. The slight imperfection made it more human, more true. She was not playing the music from a page in her mind. She was pulling it, note by note, from a deep well within her. It was the sound of her locked room being opened, not with a crash, but with a slow, painful creak of the hinges. The music filled the empty hall. It did not soar to the rafters. It seemed to seep into them, into the very wood and velvet. It was a private grief made audible. It was the sound of a burned piano singing again through different wood and wire. It was the echo of a teacher's voice, of a lost home, of a journey taken in darkness. The pianist stood in the shadow, utterly still. He was not listening as a critic, or even as a fellow musician. He was listening as a witness. He understood now that her silence had not been empty. It had been full of all this sound, trapped, with nowhere to go. The weight of it crushed his heart. He thought of his own music, his own struggles, and they felt like the complaints of a child. She played through the main theme, and then, instead of moving to a more dramatic section, she softened. The melody fragmented, becoming single notes, spaced apart by deep silence. It was as if she was tracing the outline of something that was no longer there. A ghost melody. Her head was bowed, her face hidden by a fall of hair. Her shoulders moved slightly with the effort, not of technical difficulty, but of emotional excavation. A few more notes, hanging in the air. And then, she stopped. Her hands came to rest in her lap. The final note faded, leaving a silence that felt deeper and more resonant than the silence before she had begun. It was a silence that had been earned. She did not move for a long time. The pianist could see the tension slowly leaving her shoulders, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She seemed smaller again, the momentary aura of the musician dissolving. He knew he should not applaud. That would make this a concert, and it had been the opposite of a concert. It had been a confession, a release. Very slowly, he walked out of the shadows and onto the stage. His footsteps seemed loud in a holy quiet. He stopped a respectful distance away. She finally looked up. Her face was pale, streaked with tears she hadn't seemed to notice. Her eyes were red, but in them was a strange clarity, like a sky after a storm. That he began, but his voice was rough. He cleared his throat. That was not Sylvestrov, it was something else. She gave a small, watery shake of her head. It was fragments, my teacher's variations, on an old folk tune. I cannot remember all of it. Only pieces. The pieces were enough, he said, his voice thick with emotion. More than enough. She looked down at the keyboard. Then gently, as if saying goodbye to a living thing, she closed the fallboard over the keys. The soft thump was a final punctuation. I am very tired now, she said. And it was the simple, overwhelming truth. He nodded, of course. He wanted to say 100 things, to apologize for his arrogance, to thank her for the most honest music he had ever heard, to ask her 1,000 questions. But he said none of them. Words felt clumsy and useless. Instead, he just stood there as she rose from the bench. She smoothed down her simple uniform, a gesture so ordinary it was heartbreaking. The moment was over. She walked past him, heading toward the dark backstage. He turned and followed, not to press her, but because his own path lay that way. They walked in silence through the labyrinth, the echoes of the music still seeming to cling to the curtains and ropes. When they reached the utility corridor, she went to her cart and put her work jacket back on. She was the cleaner again, her shift long over. He stood, feeling helpless. May I call for a car for you?" he asked. "No, thank you," she said softly. "The walk is short. The night air will be good." She picked up a small, worn bag from under the cart. She was ready to leave. "Tomorrow," he said, the word escaping before he could think. She paused, her hand on the heavy door to the outside. "Tomorrow is another day," she said, without looking back. "I will be here to clean before the matinee." And then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her with a solid, echoing click. The pianist stood alone in the fluorescent glare. The distant sounds of the reception were finally dying down. He felt completely empty, and yet more full than after any standing ovation. He had come to the hall that evening as a master. He was leaving it as a student who had just received the most important lesson of his life. He did not go to the party. He walked out through the front lobby, nodding silently at the confused staff, and stepped into the cool night. He looked up and down the quiet street, but she was already gone. Absorbed into the city, he began to walk, not knowing where he was going. The haunting, fragmented melody replaying over and over in his mind, each note a question he did not know how to answer. The walk home was a blur of streetlights and swirling thoughts for the pianist. The city's usual night sounds, distant sirens, laughter from a late-night cafe felt muffled, as if he was still inside the bubble of silence that had followed her music. He could still see the tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He could still hear the fragile, heartbreaking beauty of those notes pulled from a place of deep loss. He did not sleep that night. He sat by the window of his quiet, elegant apartment, looking at the grand piano that dominated the room. It suddenly seemed like a proud, loud thing, unaware of its own privilege. He thought of a piano burning, its strings snapping like cries. For the first time in many years, he felt no desire to touch his own keys. The next morning, he arrived at the concert hall hours before anyone else. The cleaning crews were finishing their work, the air smelling of citrus polish and vacuum dust. He found the head of facilities, a practical man with a clipboard. "The woman who cleans the main stage at night," the pianist began, trying to keep his voice casual. "I need to speak with her." The man consulted his schedule. "She's on daytime prep this week because of the matinee. Should be in the practice room corridor, stocking supplies." The pianist found her there, in the bright, utilitarian hallway lined with closed doors behind which scales and arpeggios were already beginning to sound. She was refilling paper towel dispensers. When she saw him, she paused, her expression unreadable. The vulnerability of the night before was hidden away, tucked behind a polite, professional mask. "Good morning," he said, feeling strangely nervous. "Good morning," she replied, turning back to her task. "I could not stop thinking," he said, the words tumbling out, "about what you shared, your music, your story." He took a breath. "I spoke with the board this morning, and with the director of the conservatory." Now she turned to face him fully, a flicker of alarm in her eyes. "There is no need for that. Please, last night was the moment. It should stay a moment. I am not asking you to perform," he said quickly, raising a hand. "I would never do that. This is not about putting you on a stage." He struggled to find the right words. "You said you care for the instruments, that you listen. This hall, this city, is full of young musicians. They have technique, ambition, but," he thought of her teacher, of the lineage of truth she carried, "they do not always have someone who can teach them how to listen to the soul of an instrument, or to the silence between the notes." She stared at him, confusion on her face. "We have created a new position," he said, his voice growing more sure. "Piano conservator. It would be your job to be the guardian of all the pianos in this building, to oversee their tuning, their care, to be the one who decides when they are ready for a performance." And he added, seeing her about to interrupt, "to be a resource for the scholarship students, the ones from difficult places, the ones who might need to hear that music can survive, even when it has been wounded." He held out a simple envelope. "This is a letter of appointment. The salary is, it is a professional salary. You would no longer clean. You would care." She did not take the envelope. Her hands remained at her sides, clenched. "This is pity," she said, her voice low. "I do not want pity. I have my work. It is honest. It is not pity," he said, his passion surprising them both. He lowered his voice as a young violinist hurried past. "It is the opposite of pity. It is recognition. Last night, you gave a masterclass in integrity. This hall does not need another star. It needs a keeper, a listener. It needs you." He placed the envelope on top of the supply cart near her hand. "The job is yours if you want it. No one will ever ask you to play, but if you ever choose to speak to a student about the teacher who learned from a master, that would be a gift. Your hours are your own. The key to every piano in this building is yours." He turned to leave, giving her space. Then he stopped. The F sharp in the 6th octave, he said, looking back. The tuner is here now. Would you like to show him what you hear? He walked away, leaving her standing in the sunny hallway, the envelope beside her, the sounds of student practice floating around her like birdsong. For a week, nothing changed. She finished her cleaning shifts. The pianist performed his matinee to great applause, which now felt like noise to him. He looked for her backstage afterward, but she was not there. Then, on a Tuesday morning, he came to the hall for a rehearsal. As he walked onto the stage, he saw her. She was not in her cleaning uniform. She wore simple, dark trousers and a plain sweater. She was standing with the head tuner, an older man with a case of tools open beside the concert Steinway. She was pointing inside the piano, speaking softly. The tuner nodded, his face thoughtful, and made a small adjustment with his hammer. He played the F sharp. Then he looked at her and smiled, giving a firm, approving nod. She had accepted the key. The change was slow, quiet, and profound. She became a gentle, constant presence. Students would find notes left on their practice room pianos, written in a neat, careful hand. The middle pedal stick is slightly loose. It will be fixed tomorrow. Play lightly on the G above middle C. The hammer felt his wearing. She would sometimes sit in the very back row of the empty hall during rehearsals, her eyes closed, just listening. Once, she approached a young, brash pianist after he had finished crashing through a loud, aggressive piece. She said nothing about his performance. She only said, quietly, "The piano is tired. If you listen, you can hear it asking for a little mercy." The young man, initially annoyed, later tried playing the same passage softly. He discovered a color in the music he had never heard before. The famous pianist made it a ritual. Before every one of his performances in that hall, he would seek her out. He would not ask for a critique or for luck. He would simply find her in a corridor, in the lighting booth, checking a practice room and ask, "Is it ready? Is it in tune?" And she would always give a small, considered nod. "It is ready," she would say, or sometimes, "It is waiting." It became the only blessing he needed. He never heard her play a full piece again. But sometimes, very late, if he was working alone on a new composition, he would hear a few distant, isolated notes from somewhere deep in the building. A single, questioning phrase, a chord resolving. It was not practice. It was a conversation, a private language between a woman and the music she had finally made peace with. One afternoon, he saw her in a small side studio. A teenage girl was there, a scholarship student from a country recently torn by war. The girl was talented but played with a stiff, frightened anger. The woman was not teaching her technique. She had asked the girl to play just one note, and to hold it, and to listen to how it lived and died in the room. "Now," the woman said softly, in her own language, which the girl understood, "play the note that feels like it wants to come next. Not from the page, from the silence after the first one." The girl, hesitantly, did. Then another. A simple, mournful melody began to form, born from feeling, not from notation. The woman nodded, her eyes warm. "Yes, that is yours. That is how you begin." The pianist slipped away, a lump in his throat. He understood. She was not building concert careers. She was showing them how to find the key to their own locked rooms. Years later, the famous pianist gave what the papers called his farewell performance in that hall. It was a massive event, broadcast and recorded. After the final bow, after the last roaring wave of applause had faded and the crowd had left, he remained on the stage, saying goodbye to the instrument that had been his partner for decades. The hall was dark and empty, or so he thought. As he placed his hand on the piano lid for the last time, he heard a soft sound, a single, pure, perfect. A note sang out from the back of the hall. He turned. There, in the very last row, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure. She stood, not applauding, but acknowledging. It was the note she had played that first night, the note of truth. He placed his hand over his heart and gave a slow, deep bow, not to the audience that was gone, but to the listener who remained. He left the stage, and she stayed in the shadows, the caretaker of the silence, the keeper of the keys, the woman who had taught a famous man that the most important music is not always the one played for the world, but the one that survives, quietly, to mend the broken notes in others. The hall was safe. The music would continue.